Ja, nu är den grön.
Hallå?
Nu är den grönare. Den ska vara grön och grönare.
Ja, grön och grönare.
Det är liksom lite opedagogiskt.
Men man ser ju inte klok ut. Det är väl det som är... Eller det syns kanske knappt. Nej.
Det syns knappt. Det låter mycket bättre.
Ja.
För nu har du liksom konstant.
Då slipper jag liksom gå fram och tillbaka. Så här, liksom. Ja.
Sen att du hör dåligt här beror på att du står i radioskugga här mellan.
Ja.
Det motverkar ju rundgång.
Nej, men jag hör att det ekar. Det gör jag.
Du kan själv gå upp och höra att det hörs bättre om du vill.
Jag litar på det.
Ja.
Man kan inte rädda sig.
Ja, bra.
Men som sagt, det tar några sekunder så du såg innan de hinner som kommer upp i fart.
Och kan man ha två samtidigt också?
Ja, alla tre. Det är inga problem.
Ja.
Bara att du måste liksom låta dem värmas upp räkna till 5.
Mm.
So how am I going to the microphone? Yeah, let me try that. And then
Hey. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see so many faces at this early hour. I'm Mark Schweder, and I'm happy to chair this first plenary session with an introductory talk on crisis in an ethical perspective, Futurize. And Futurize is, as you may have already guessed, an acronym for a very long project title. That's the future of intergenerational solidarity beyond the pandemic, empirically informed ethical analysis and public deliberation. And you may wonder, what has ethics to do with crisis at all? And well, for one, both words have the same origin. They both come from ancient Greek. Ethics comes from ethos in Greek, which means custom, traditional morality, traditional sets of moral rules that guide behavior in a community. Like, for example, you should respect your parents, right? That's ethos, that's custom. And ethics is the philosophical theory of ethos. So it's moral philosophy in a way. It's a philosophical theory of the moral rules that guide behavior in a community. Now, why should anyone need philosophers in this context? Why should anyone need a philosophical theory of the ethos? The only answer can be because they're desperate. Yeah? They're in a crisis. And that's exactly what ethics is about. The hour of ethics comes when traditional morality, when traditional moral rules are in a crisis, when their meaning and their validity is no longer evident and clear, but is controversial and is debated. So it's no longer clear, for example, what it means to respect your parents, or it's even debated whether it's good to respect your parents. Then ethics, so the philosophical theory of the ethos, comes into play in order to try and clarify the meaning and the justification or validity of the ethos, of the moral rules in a community. So as ethicists, we're somehow in love with the crisis. We're actually married to the crisis. And the more crisis, the better. So when the Polycrisis arrives, it's a heyday for ethics, right? And that was actually the starting point of the project that we're going to be talking about. It was the coronavirus pandemic and the crisis it meant for intergenerational relations. Because suddenly, when the pandemic arrived, everyone was talking about intergenerational relations, about intergenerational solidarity. But it was completely unclear what they meant by intergenerational solidarity, and it was also very unclear what follows, normatively speaking, from intergenerational solidarity. So, for example, some claimed, especially in the first wave of the pandemic, that intergenerational solidarity required younger people to stay at home and to conform with infection control measures, to accept burdens, to accept limitations, restrictions of their individual liberties, of their quality of life, for the sake of protecting the well-being and the health and the lives of the older generation. But at the same time, we had voices stating, no, intergenerational solidarity requires us to focus on younger people and to do everything possible to protect the future and the well-being of the younger generation. And older people should look after themselves or should isolate themselves, but it's not like it's not the task of the community as a whole to protect this group in particular. So this was this kind of stress test, this crisis for intergenerational solidarity was the starting point of the project. We were asking, or are asking, how are appeals to intergenerational solidarity used in individual moral considerations and public as well as policy debates in different national contexts? To what extent are these moral and political uses of ideas of intergenerational solidarity justifiable from a moral philosophical point of view? So what is their justification, and is it sound? And what are public visions for future intergenerational relations in the aftermath of the pandemic and in the face of further crisis in Europe? So, for example, the war, for example, the climate crisis, or the crisis of democracies, liberal democracies. Now, how do we tackle these questions in the project? We empirically explore public attitudes and views of intergenerational solidarity in different countries. We conduct policy document and media analysis. We conduct stakeholder interviews with people from the policy and policy advice context that played a role in the pandemic, and also 8 focus groups with people from different age groups in 3 different countries. And we are planning to conduct a quantitative online survey with 3,600 people per country. And per country means Germany, Sweden, and the UK, because that's the selection of countries we're investigating in the project. We then plan an ethical evaluation, a moral philosophical analysis of and characterization of the different views on intergenerational solidarity that we will explore and collect and identify. We will classify and compare them also between different national contexts and discuss their moral legitimacy and their acceptability. And finally, there's a public engagement element in the project. We will kind of set up a format of participatory deliberation, a future workshop to discuss in each of the 3 countries with representatives of civil society groups about intergenerational relations and about the renegotiation, so to speak, of the moral foundations of intergenerational relations. And that's like the general outline of the project, and I'll hand over now to my colleague Andreas, I guess. Probably. This is because he's member of the project team. We're 3 project teams in 3 different countries, and we'll be presenting first results from our research. And I'll hand over to Andreas.
And as you see, there's more Swedish members of the team, and there's also co-author here. And where are we now? So I just continue here. Yeah. Okay. So this is just about 10 minutes, and in a way, it's a post-futurized thinking already. And we discussed things even yesterday during the dinner, and we had the argument. Well, maybe it could be an argument, and we will just try to do this. So it's about aging life course and solidarity, and in the end, it's more an aging research or a gerontological perspective, and the background is the issue of age integration, kind of a dream that we always had in gerontology, and related to the issue of solidarity and the question of intergenerational solidarity, and maybe going beyond this. So we increasingly talk about solidarity in times of crisis, and well, the reason that we thought that behind it was already mentioned by Mark. So the question is, why is it such a common theme when policy intervention measures tend to fail or create unfair distribution of costs? Why do we cry for solidarity if the institutions do not work as they should? And why is it often used just in relation to age? So maybe more formal questions in the sense of the European Commission: can solidarity as a normative framework or social practice bridge generation and temporal divides to advance social cohesion? So this is more the formal side, but the challenge of achieving solidarity across age and the absence of age integration could be questioned. So we could ask, is it possible to have intergenerational solidarity if we structure society by age? And if you structure access to goods, if you structure access to rights, to life chances by this, and isn't that contradictory in a way? Solidarity question just to have a broad understanding or a narrow or pluralistic understanding. I think it's not key which we choose here, but basically a pluralistic understanding goes of course easiest. The willingness to recognize norms, values, and commitments of solidarity as distinct from those of distributive justice. And then there's the issue of reciprocity. So the reciprocity is not needed here because it's just about the access or the potential access or the potential coverage of rights and needs. And it's not necessary to have a fully egalitarian relationship here. Going back to how society looks like, and there is a temporal fabric of society. Societies are structured by time. There's age diversity, people of different ages, different people born at different times, living together at the same point in time in different points of their life courses. And age plays a central role in structuring societies and people's existence, basically. This is increasing with longevity, so the aging society is even more age diverse than it was before. So we have longer age ranges, we have more different cohorts living parallel at the same time. And if you take two perspectives, the old and the young, and this is simplistic, I know, but well, otherwise it's maybe too much. So we have manifested past futures. If you look at older people had uncertainty in the beginning. They had their life courses, and we have outcomes of life courses that coin situations where people live in. And we have the young individuals continue to face uncertainty, need to manage unpredictability at this point in time, which creates different expectations, but also perspectives, for example, on crisis. And this is usually your topic, that from this perspective, different views on crisis and different views on potential needs for intervention also show up. So we have this traditionally discussed under the headline of Gleichzeitigkeit des Ungleichzeitigen, also the simultaneity of the unsimultaneous with Bloch and so on. That's old stories, but it describes exactly where we are. So we have people at one time in history that are at different points in time of their life courses. There's a mismatch, and individuals and age groups live in overlapping but nevertheless distinct realities and prospects with own time perspectives in a shared historical time. This is that's what we have. If we look at, as gerontologists, always on one time perspective, but if you look in a life course perspective and in an intergenerational perspective, we have a different view. Then we have social institutions that try to produce cohesion and inclusion by organizing the interdependency between them. This is then what we have as societal institutions. And we have social risk and life chances that institutions at different levels. And it's not just the big social security institutions, it's also families, networks, communities, anything on the society and state level. They do inter and inter-age group allocation of resources, cost to address moderate cover, meet level out social risks, needs within the framework of societal institutions. So we have these different age groups living in different times or different positions in their life courses at the same time with different expectations, but also with different needs and risks. And we have institutions that level this out. So this is not just a modern welfare state, but it's also the family that transfers risks and resources between this. And you can look at this that way. Then we have change or crisis, the topic that you mentioned, that disturbs the whole thing. So it's not stable anymore. We have imbalances. So this system of rebalancing or of needs and risks by these institutions gets under pressure. Population aging, for example, is simple. The quantitative proportions of these groups change over time. We suddenly have less younger people, more older people living longer. Maybe there's also new needs by this. And then we have also reduced institutional capacity. So institutions don't have the resources under crisis, so they don't work as they should or that they expect to work. And that is the situation. So just coming back, we have people at different times in their life courses living in parallel. We have usually a kind of balancing by social institutions. This is disturbed simply by changing the population proportions, but also the capacities of these institutions. So we have quite a chaos in this system that should be in a kind of equilibrium, in a kind of a balance, at least over time. And then we have also the issue that the risks change. Also, we have a change from growth to loss compensation. And so what is distributed is something different. It's not just distributing the good, but it's also distributing the bad. So losing is something that is more common. I mean, we discussed this recently in Tokyo with some colleagues, but it's the idea that change in modernity is changing from reform and from growth to risk and to a different type of risk, and in particular also the risk of losses that need to be distributed. And then the question is solidarity just an approach to manage risks, deficits, and losses under crisis in the end? So solidarity can serve as a normal practice when institutional security and redistribution system weaken or fail in response to challenges. At least this is quite often visible in the public discourse, not all the time, and well, we will see what happens with the public discourse if you analyze it. But at least we have a situation where this is increasingly common. If you look at the pandemic, it was a crisis that nobody had full control of. And the first thing that I at least was called to be solidaric, in particular with other people, or people should be solidaric with me because I was a risk group, or I turned into a risk group during this time, getting closer to 60 and so on. And suddenly I was somebody who was benefiting also from the solidarity call. Or should be benefit at least, but the benefits differed also quite a lot if you look at different countries. Then we have some experience. Solidarity practice offers opportunities to enact collective action. There's socio-ecological crises that necessitate moving beyond parallel linear conceptions of time, and that's where the thinking started about the age integration. Then there's research that points at the tension between differing perceptions of time, particularly when it comes to climate. And then the assumption that social movements play a role in mediating these diverse temporal experiences that foster spaces of shared understanding and collective engagement. Going back to the question, and time is over, or probably already over since a while, no? Okay, then we are back to the question at the beginning. Can solidarity, both as a framework of norms and social practices, bridge generational and temporal divides for social cohesion and resilience in societies facing complex overlapping crises? Maybe. But it raises the question for policy options for solidarity and so on to move beyond simplistic categorizations of age based on chronological age and cohort membership. And maybe we need to overcome exactly this to generate solidarity, but then it would mean that we also do not do intergenerational solidarity anymore, but we do solidarity along the line of needs and risks and perspectives, and that could be a more adequate way maybe to redistribute them adequately. The main thing is to foster age-inclusive approaches in this perspective and practices, and this is, again, as I said before, already a dream of gerontology since quite a while. And it could have a new background by this, but that was the starting point, and well, then we have to discuss or continue, but this is where we are. Thanks. So just continue.
I think we have time for questions, right?
Should we have just a discussion?
We'll have a Q&A at the end, but if there are any like immediate questions?
Yeah.
Yes, one.
Yeah, I have. What is intergenerational solidarity, and how do you define intergenerational solidarity in this context? And also, what issues are particularly important in relation to intergenerational solidarity?
I think there may be different answers from different participants in the project. What's intergenerational solidarity? My starting point, at least when we started to discuss this, was always the public discourse on intergenerational solidarity as a norm and as kind of a call for action. I did studies I had a silver certification just 2 weeks ago, and in my PhD part, when an intergenerational solidarity means simply transfer between family generations and the welfare state redistribution between people of different ages, for example, in the pension system or in the healthcare system. So you can have different definitions.
I think that's one core issue in the problem.
Oh, so sorry. Yeah, should I repeat?
No. I think we will.
I'm sorry.
I think we will be talking about intergenerational solidarity quite a lot in this panel, also in the
That's what I assume, yeah.
concluding discussion, because it's the topic of the project. But one thing to keep in mind is that we actually have different disciplines here that approach the topic from different angles and different definitions. So we have what you just described was a very, I would say, sociological, descriptive. Exactly. Exactly, and that's my job in the project, right? To have a more like normative concept of intergenerational solidarity, what it means. But I think we'll keep this as a core topic for the concluding discussion. And I would like to hand over now to the next presentation, which is, if I'm right, held by Patricia Donovan, also on behalf of her colleague Paul Hicks from the University College in London. She will be speaking about the baby boomer generation as a focus for intergenerational solidarity and/or conflict in the UK media. Patricia.
Thank you so much, Mark. Yes, indeed, I do represent the Team UK portion of the Futurize project. And today I will be presenting some insights from our media analysis. Specifically, for the purpose of this presentation, we have used the concept of the baby boomer generation as a lens to provide a qualitative overview of empirical exploration conducted in the UK. So to get started, I will be providing some very brief background information, followed by a look at how generational discourse is used in the sample from the UK. And then in turn, we will look at how solidarity and conflict are approached in the sampled articles. As we will see, the two concepts are quite entangled. And finally, I will offer some initial conclusions. So now some quick background. The newspapers we have sampled in the UK are the left-leaning Observer and the right-leaning Sunday Telegraph. Both are weekend editions of broadsheets or quality press, in line with the selections also made in Germany, chosen so as to capture a more reflective, in-depth look at the news stories during the time period, which is essentially the first 2 years and 3 months of the COVID-19 pandemic. And to do this, we have used qualitative content analysis. So what have we seen generally in terms of generational discourse in the UK media? Well, firstly, the use of generational terms does occur and is indeed becoming more prevalent, relatively speaking, in comparison to categories like old and young or older and younger age. That said, there is a considerable caveat in that generational terms are primarily used in the generational equity debate, plus also in areas like culture and popular culture reporting. So specifically in our sample, which relates to the COVID-19 pandemic, most references were to kinship generations, seen especially in reporting of education and school closures. And these referred to 3 cohorts, so school-age children, parents of working age, and retired grandparents. Thus, this also evoked a life course perspective. As Mark noted, a part of the Futurize project is also an analysis of policy papers. And in the UK, we have found that the above points also hold true across the policy papers examined. So the discourse is not exclusive to the media. And before continuing, I just want to show you some examples of the prominent headlines from our sample relating to generational equity and the baby boomer generation. In the top left corner is The Observer with the headline, "Baby boomers are the winners who have taken it all. Now it's time they gave some back." While underneath, the Sunday Telegraph has questions for the woke generation. Young people today face terrible pressures, the climate crisis, a dearth of jobs and housing, the relentless gaze of social media. But did the elders have it any better? Our boomer agony uncle finds out. And actually, in general, we have found that the Sunday Telegraph, which is more conservative, tends to advocate more in favor of baby boomers, as we will also see later on. Finally, on the right of the screen, we also have a cartoon published this year in The Guardian, which we have included as this topic is still very prominent in the media. And you can see the contrast between the happy baby boomer with a paid-off mortgage for a nice warm house, receiving winter fuel payments from the government, and on the other hand, someone of a younger age in their freezing cold home with bills piling up. So on that note, how has solidarity been a theme in our UK sample? Well, firstly, calls for solidarity framed in reference to social generations were negligible. One notable exception is an Observer article titled Boomers versus Millennials. Let's call up the hostilities. This is one fight we can all do without right now. And so the theme, that same theme of appeal for solidarity in the face of conflict at a time of crisis is one that we see recurring and to which we will return. But overall, discussions of intergenerational solidarity did refer to more general categorizations like the young and the old. Yet, it is important to note this usually framed solidarity as something being undermined, for instance, by the government or prime minister, as the below quotation from the Observer captures. It states, at a time when the prime minister should be building the social solidarity that encourages compliance with self-isolation, he is divisively trying to shift the blame for rising infection rates to the public, particularly to young people. And despite the mixed messaging over the summer that pushed people to do their bit by returning to the office and socializing. So considering these points, what was the focus for solidarity appeals during this time, if not generational relations? Well, in the UK, it was primarily the National Health Service. For example, the UK government promoted the phrase, stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. And accordingly, the public participated in initiatives like clapping for carers in order to thank the NHS. So let us now turn to conflict, wherein baby boomers and indeed other socio-historical generations become more salient in the sample, despite still only appearing in a modest portion of the total articles. So then other articles that did explicitly reference social generations, most discourse was around describing existing conflict or, on the other hand, pleas to resolve said conflict, especially vis-a-vis generational equity. And in such cases, boomers were presented as selfish, and this occurred mostly in the left-leaning Observer, whilst articles advocating for the position of retirees and pensioners usually omitted the term baby boomers. You can see a couple of examples of the latter at the bottom of the screen. And we see that in this debate, the term baby boomer has certain negative connotations that writers often try to circumvent by using alternate phrasing. So to briefly conclude, the Futurise project has been using the COVID-19 pandemic as a stress test and thereby a starting point to help draw conclusions for other crises. And we have seen that the evidence from the UK demonstrates how pre-existing discourses shape discussions in times of even unexpected crises such as the pandemic. This will be key for understanding discourse in the case of the Polycrisis. And similarly, calls for solidarity operate in and adapt to country-specific conditions, like those pre-existing discourses I've just mentioned. In the UK media, solidarity is seen as desirable, yet most reporting was primarily concerned with conflict at the then present time, particularly regarding generational equity, and also wider concerns around the economy and the labour market. While conflict was discussed in and of itself, solidarity was always presented in conjunction with or as a juxtaposition to conflict. And finally, the baby boomer generation, whether evoked explicitly or implicitly, are usually framed as the main antagonist in generational equity debates. And that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Patricia. Any immediate questions, not the big ones, not what is solidarity or something, just comprehension questions? No? Okay. Then I'm happy to introduce the next two speakers, Eva Katharina Boser and Lena Dörmann, who will be presenting a talk in which also Niklas Elrich Groppe was involved on perspectives on intergenerational relations regarding responsibility and solidarity during the pandemic in the public discourse in Germany?
Thank you, Mark, for the kind introduction. So we represent a work in progress paper we are working currently on with our colleague Niklas. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, generations were affected differently by the virus and lockdown measures. In broader public debates, we could see a juxtaposition of the stereotypically depicted vulnerable, old and isolated and elderly homes, here under the title of Loneliness Kills, versus the reckless young pursuing their individual freedoms without caring for the needs of the so-called old. And in between, people were reduced to, for example, being the overworked, overburdened, middle-aged, caring for children and older relatives. And in this paper, we would like to challenge these stereotypes and show the complexity of these intergenerational relationships in the context of entangled crisis. So COVID-19 was a global public health crisis. And in Germany, we saw an entanglement of different crisis phenomenon across various sectors of society, for example, in care or mental health, or challenging the democratic system in general. And within the public discourse in Germany on COVID-19, we had many references to images of aging or age stereotypes. And in an effort to manage the crisis, references to solidarity served to justify heterogeneous, sometimes contradictory, political and moral claims. So in the light of interconnected crisis, the question arises, what lessons can be learned from German public discourse on COVID-19 to promote intergenerational cohesion and prevent ageism and crisis beyond the pandemic? To unfold the conceptual dimensions of our research questions, we will first provide some theoretical background considerations in regard of solidarity, following by an analysis of German newspaper articles and documents. So first, the heuristic framework of the concept of solidarity, including the following 4 elements. So solidarity means based on identification due to a commonality within or towards a group or person, making a contribution and carrying costs to pursue a normative goal. And just a spoiler, keep the colors in mind for further analysis. So these general elements can be understood as a conceptual framework to demonstrate a semantically adequate use of solidarity on a descriptive level. However, for assessing reference to solidarity in public discourse, we need a concept that provides further normative criteria for the evaluation of appeals to solidarity in these debates. Therefore, we secondly enrich the general 4 elements with normative criteria for a morally meaningful conception of solidarity, which provides criteria for the evaluation of solidarity recourses in debates, in order to interpret these characteristics more densely, and it allows the moral value of conceptual use to be assessed. So here's now the ethical metrics or the normative criteria for an adapted conception of solidarity. First, when we look at the element of identification, it is not just any form of identification, but one that is open on individual and also structural level. And second, when we look at the group element, it is not about only forming a group, but it should be about forming a group that should emphasize inclusiveness while respecting differences. And third, when we look at the contribution, both the contribution to achieve normative goal and related burdens need to be appropriate. And fourth, when we look at the normative goal of solidarity, it needs to be justified based on a plurality of diverse reasons. So all of these criteria you see here in this ethical matrix are fundamentally open and context sensitive. And we are now equipped for a normatively enriched understanding of solidarity in order to assess our empirical material. To examine the research question, we executed a 2-tiered methodological approach. So first, we conducted a media analysis of 2 German weekly newspapers, Die Zeit and Welt am Sonntag, between March 2020 and June 2023. And second, we analyzed ethical recommendations and policy papers between February 2020 and March 2023. And so when we say media debates provide insights at the intersection of politics, society, and also healthcare ethics, they are context dependent and multi-faced. However, they can influence political decision-making processes. And therefore, It is important to not only focus on media debates, but also to compare these debates within politics and science. And for this reason, we specifically analyzed policy papers and ethical recommendations from relevant stakeholders and civil society organizations and institutions that represent intergenerational perspectives in a pertinent way. So, media and the document analysis we conducted follow the methodological framework of Cook-Carts. And for this paper, we will now focus on an in-depth analysis of 2 paradigmatic cases in a thematic matrix with key material on intergenerational solidarity during COVID-19. And I now hand over to my colleague, Lena.
Thank you. Okay. So for the first paradigmatic case, we chose one from the media analysis. Here we have an interview with 4 individuals with from diverse age groups and with different social backgrounds. And the following 3 aspects are most pertinent for our research interest. First, within the material, we can see a certain understanding of social cohesion. And also second, in the context of crisis, it became clear that women, especially in the context of familial structures, had a specific burden that hasn't been recognized enough within political measures and also by broader society. And as a third aspect, we can see a specific intergenerational strain. The crisis hit primarily precariously employed and especially younger and middle-aged generations. The second paradigmatic case stems from the document analysis. Here we have an ethical recommendation by the German Ethics Council, which addresses the ethical and social implications of lockdowns, resource allocation, and strategies to balance public health with economic and also democratic considerations. It was published at an early stage of the pandemic. Societies were facing public health and also societal challenges. And under these circumstances, the German Ethics Council underlines criteria for a strategy shift and also the importance of societal cohesion during crisis. We will now put this together in our thematic matrix on intergenerational solidarity during COVID-19 in Germany. In the analysis, we want to reconstruct how understanding of solidarity between generations can be identified in the material on a descriptive level. And I will now go through the 4 elements and then first come to the first paradigmatic case and then to the second paradigmatic case. So with the first element, identification, on the one hand, we saw a focus on family ties, but also challenged social embeddedness across generations. And then on the other hand, in the ethical recommendation, there has been a call for individual responsibility in social embeddedness with claims to follow the measures established for pandemic combat. In the second element group, we have a dialogue to bring divided generations together instead of playing generations off against each other, even though we see different needs between the generations. Then the Ethics Council is speaking of young versus old generations in relation to a diversification of risks and the aim of protecting risk groups. Within the third element, contribution, in the first paradigmatic case, there's not only mentioning care for children, but also for relatives and employees with a specific focus on gendered double roles. And then the Ethics Council underlines solidarity, cooperativeness, and a claim to put others first with regards to balancing of interest. The last or fourth element, the normative goal. The first paradigmatic case shows reference to not only solidarity between family ties, but also broader solidaristic social systems within society across generations to provide equal opportunities and also trust on individual and structural level. And the Ethics Council underlines the subsidiarity principle with a joint responsibility of different actors to care for the vulnerable. In a second step, we'll now build an ethical matrix that enables to put references to solidarity on a descriptive level in the public discourse to test. And hereby we discuss the findings from our analysis within broader theories of solidarity, responsibility, and care relationships. We now have a productive turn in discussing the material with the adapted normative framework of solidarity based on the 4 conceptions introduced in the ethical metrics by Aoife before. So self versus external attribution of generational identity and roles like age and gender within broader power structures that we can see in the private as well in the public sphere within the conception of identification. Then the neglect of inter- and intra-group diversity produce risks of stereotyping and also othering, for example, ageism within the conception of the group. And we have the heterogeneity of generational responsibility, which is insufficiently institutionalized during COVID-19 when we look at the conception of contribution. And as for the 4th conception, the normative goal, there's an incomplete justification of generational responsibilities. And in total, it becomes clear that the 4 elements of solidarity are to be classified normatively, and that means it is not about any goal, but about a normatively justified one. To conclude, we saw that intergenerational solidarity can be understood as socially embedded or as a socially embedded practice of responsibility and care that manifests in everyday interactions and also institutional settings. Rather than being primarily the outcome of political intervention, it arises from shared experiences of social connectedness and thus contributes significantly to sustaining democratic cohesion and fostering reflection on generational and social differences. As implications for the future, we need to conceptualize intergenerational solidarity in a justified way and also to acknowledge conceptual intersections within solidarity, responsibility, and care. And we need an international comparison that we also want to provide within the FutureRace project as a basis for a crisis-resistant and inclusive approach, just intergenerational relations in the Polycrisis. Thank you very much.
Oh, that's a good idea. Much better. Who will be talking about risk, age, and solidarity?
Yes, thank you, Mark. And yeah, just stay with me the last 10 minutes or so, and then we're nearing the end. Yeah, Mark gave you the title there already, so we can go straight into it. So this is the Swedish case of the FutureRace project so far. And as everyone else in this panel, we're also using this crisis context of societies facing structural crises, which are increasingly framed in this polycrisis or permacrisis framing, this sort of interlinked emergency, creating a constant state of alert. This presentation looks at it through Beck's risk society theory, which argues that modernization has led to this globally interconnected risks that are numerous and they're competing with each other, sort of straining both attention and resources. So there's a lot of trade-offs going on. And this creates uneven distribution of these risks, which identifies then certain groups as vulnerable and which generates also new social tension. And one of these tensions are, of course, the generational one. And here we see long-term risk horizons, such as climate, such as maybe demographic change, sort of challenging the idea or the expectations, like Lucas was talking about yesterday, the expectations of the generational contract, at least from the younger perspective, of not leaving them worse off than their parents or grandparents, for example. And this puts intergenerational solidarity under pressure, then especially in this context of overlapping crises, when again you don't know where to put the attention or where to put the resources because everything is happening at the same time. So this is the backdrop for this presentation. And the aim here was to explore then how different types of overlapping societal crises, specifically the COVID pandemic and the climate crisis, and how that sort of shape the responses of intergenerational solidarity. And then the question that we're asking here is, how do risk exposure in the pandemic and the climate crisis influence the scope and maybe even the direction of intergenerational solidarity in the Swedish media discourse when we're looking at that? So methodology-wise, we also used a content analysis in our national print media. So we used the two largest newspapers in Sweden. So that's Dagens Nyheter and Svenska Dagbladet, which is this three-pronged keyword search, which gave us a sample of 235 articles. The time frame is the same as the others. It's during the pandemic. We use this deductive inductive coding. And we're not completely done with the analysis yet. So some of the material I will show now is also for illustrative purposes, basically. And we'll start with this woman that I've talked about earlier this week. She's always a good way to illustrate things. So in the material, there are some occurrences where you see all these codes of solidarity, intergenerational relations, the pandemic, and the climate sort of all intersecting in the same paragraphs. And a lot of these occasions come from interviews with Greta, of course, because she's one of the people that actually connects climate and COVID in the media discourse that we see. And I think this excerpt here to the right is a really good illustration of how shifting crises also shifts the attention of who's at risk and then also the direction of solidarity. So if I read it out here, so it reads that 2020, which Greta Thunberg had called for to be the year of action on climate change, instead became the year of the coronavirus. And then this is Greta speaking. She says that I remember in the beginning there were going to be big climate strikes in France. People advised us not to cancel as it wasn't forbidden to demonstrate yet. But in a crisis, everyone must take responsibility, take a step back and act in solidarity with their fellow human beings. And that's what we did. When we are in a crisis, we may sometimes have to do things that we would rather not do. I would prefer to just go to school and not have all the attention, but that's a very small price to pay when you think about the situation we're in. So what we see then in the media discourse during the pandemic is that you see this sorting of risks based on age and on diagnosis to sort of structure and prioritize intervention. And here is another example in regards to vaccine prioritization. And this one reads that most people who get seriously ill from COVID-19 are those at risk. And a majority of those who die belong to older age groups, while the volunteers in the trials are young. The vaccine should protect risk groups above all. That is the important thing. It doesn't matter that you can protect healthy people and young people. They won't get very sick anyway, and they will respond best to the vaccine regardless. So vaccination and treatment priority order are here, I think, clear examples of this risk sorting that's going on, where you have one priority group, which is based on age. This is sort of a generalized risk group definition. And then you have one priority group, which is based on morbidity status. And this is sort of where you have this diagnosis then of chronic or acute diseases. And in relation to solidarity, then we see it along these lines of age and morbidity. But there's also an important distinction that we find in the material between age group solidarities. So that's the references to age group in material. And then there's also a difference with generational cohort solidarity, which is when you see the references to generational cohorts in the materials. I will just show that quickly as well. So for age group solidarity, so this means the references to age groups and solidarity in material, we find that it emerges in the context of immediate risks. So here we have 3 examples, and I won't read the excerpts here, just give you the examples. So you see risk and solidarity by isolation. You see risk and solidarity by distancing. And then you see risk and solidarity by burdens. And basically, these solidarities are all about avoiding contracting the COVID-19 virus, because that's the immediate risk. It's directly related to the morbidity status. So age group solidarity here then is solidarity regarding generalized health risks. And the difference to generational cohort solidarity then is, and this again is the references to generations and solidarity in the material. Sorry. We find that it emerges in the context of distant risk. And here we have 3 examples as well. So we have risk and solidarity in the economy. We have risk and solidarity for education. And then we have risk and solidarity for climate. And basically, these are all about avoiding the consequences, the long-term consequences of COVID. So there are no immediate risks, and they are indirectly related to morbidity status. So then generational cohort solidarity is solidarity regarding generalized risks of overall consequences. So to wrap it up for conclusion, I think we can say that the pandemic initially saw solidarity to target immediate risks, again, directly related to mortality. And then you have long-term chronic threats, such as climate, which calls for solidarity to mitigate distant risk. I don't think this is a no-brainer, I think. Everyone understands this. Or maybe not, I heard a laughter. But in the context of intergenerational solidarity then, of course, the pandemic and the climate are very different types of crises, but I would argue that they're still comparable in this risk logic, and that they're shaped then by perceptions of risk and vulnerability. And that's how it relates to this discussion of intergenerational solidarity, because maybe risk is some sort of underlying mechanisms of how solidarity is directed and what the scope of solidarity is. So that's the argument that I'm making here, that that risk context determines the scope of solidarity, in sort of moving the boundary of what's in your in-group and what's your out-group, and the focus in any given situation. And just the last point, and if I want you to remember anything, I want you to remember this word here, and it's also a Swedish lesson for you. So this is solidarisk, and in Swedish is the act of showing solidarity. And as you can see, you can't spell solidarisk without risk in it. And this is just a coincidence with how Swedish words end, so it's not semantically connected. But I think it's a good reminder that, at least for me in my continuing research, I will look close between this relationship between risk and intergenerational solidarity. And that means looking at sort of risk perception, risk construction, how risk is constructed in media, for example, or other discourses, and also risk distribution, how it's distributed across the population. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Nico. I think we have now roughly 10 minutes for questions, discussion.
The box is back.
Great, you can throw it into the audience.
Yeah, we'll give it a try.
Okay.
Maybe not that.
You need to, is it okay if I throw it?
Yay.
And then I don't just speak into it or like this. Speak into it. It's a question on the discourses. When do discourses reflect as solidaric thinking, and when do they actually make divisions? Because some of your quotations, you have directly the opposition between younger and older age groups. But what we saw in Denmark was that our prime minister also talked about these different groups, but the we who were talking were always the young or middle-aged groups. The other were the vulnerable, older, ill and sick persons. And I was very upset by it, because suddenly, as Andreas said, suddenly I realized that I belong to the vulnerable group,
And I just got so angry because then I wasn't a part of the we.
You're not
I
we.
was a part of the others who had to be protected by being isolated. And at the same time, I had, of course, to take care of my teaching online and so on. So I couldn't, or at least I was isolated, but I was still part of the living and the society and all the demands that were put up on us in order to keep society going. So I have the question about when can discourses lead to solidarity, and when do they actually make stronger oppositions between age groups? And if you have reflected on that, yeah.
So, anyone? Should I?
Go first, and I can give it.
Okay, I think this is a really important question that we're thinking a lot about this inadvertent effect of solidarity discourses to reinforce actually divisions. And so for the media analysis, we didn't distinguish between pro and con solidarity statements, but really just looked at the discourse and at any kind of statements that mentioned or were about solidarity. But in effect, I would argue at least that the concept of solidarity, that the working definition that Eva and Lena presented in their presentation already shows that there's something in the semantics of the concept of solidarity itself that can promote othering, because it's always about these groups relationships. As you said, we and they, right? This is, I would argue, this is intrinsic to the very concept of solidarity. There's always this kind of group relationship. And as Andreas actually indicated in his presentation, it very often in the discourse becomes entangled with age stereotypes. So talk about generations is kind of mixed and intertwined with age stereotypes. And so age groups and generations are kind of, the perspectives are conflated somehow. And this actually nurtures or can nurture ageist attitudes and and thereby undermine the very idea. So the concept of solidarity itself has the risk that appeals to intergenerational solidarity effectively reinforce a division and ageism. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the great question. I just wanted to quickly add that conflict was something we did not have in our deductive codebook. So it was, but very at the early stage of the media analysis, we needed to add the code conflict, like in an inductively way to the codebook, because it was so present in the free countries.
There's time for one more question. Scared everyone off. Well, there's nothing else, then again, thank you very much to all speakers. Thank you for listening and for taking the time. I think now we have thank you.
Yeah.
Presentation well, it's losing the voice.